some people, seeing an Excel spreadsheet makes their hearts beat fast with excitement. For them, a line item budget may be all they need to be inspired to give generously to the church. For the rest of us, however, it takes more than numbers and dollar signs and decimal points and subtotals to get our hearts pumping with excitement. For us, stories get us excited. We want to hear about lives being touched, about hope being offered, about people being connected or reconnected to the loving, compassionate God that Jesus came to show us. For us, it's not numbers, but narratives that reach deep into our hearts and inspire us to give generously. My name is Ken Sloane, and I'm Director of Stewardship and Generosity at Discipleship Ministries, and I'm excited to announce the launch of a new online course, Creating a Narrative Budget, the story behind the numbers. Through 8 self-paced sessions, participants will learn generosity theory as well as the practical nuts and bolts of constructing a narrative budget that they can share with their own congregations. I've been in ministry for 40 years, and I've spent the last 15 years helping churches interpret their ministry and grow generosity. In that time, I've become strongly convinced of a couple of things. We need to constantly connect money to ministry and mission. We need to get past believing that our congregations are going to grow in generosity because we simply tell them we have bills to pay. We need to let go of the notion that obligation, duty, and commitment are enough to motivate people to give more generously. And finally, we need to be more intentional about finding the stories of where our church is making an impact and sharing those stories in a way that gets people excited. I believe a narrative budget is a great tool to help your church do just that. And here's some good news. The course will launch in early to mid-September and will be offered at no cost for United Methodist congregations, thanks to your church's generous support of the World Service Fund. There will be a second version that will offer half a CEU credit, which will have a $25 registration fee. You can pre-register for the course right now by going to the website on your screen, umcdiscipleship.org/narrative budget. Thanks, and I hope to see you in the course.
Well, welcome everyone and good evening. Thank you so much for being online with us. You are the very first to hear. We actually just produced that introduction video just a few minutes ago. We just wrapped it up. So you're the very first to hear about this new course. Please feel free to message me if you have any questions about that. We've got a lot to cover, so I'm going to make this quick as we jump in. For those of you who have joined us before, great to see you back. I'm looking at our attendees. We have a lot of names here that I've seen before. It's really wonderful to see. I asked everybody in the chat where they're listening from, and I can't even read them fast enough. We have so many people attending tonight. This is a very, very popular webinar. I'm honored to be serving on it right now. And we are here in the chat for you if you need anything from the technology perspective. Let me point this out a little bit and clarify this. So my name is Blake. I run the tech, and we'll say the webinar producer here to kind of make things sure that hopefully things run smoothly. And so if you have a tech issue, send that to me in the chat. Just send it to the chat. It comes to all three of us, but I'll be the one monitoring that in the chat. And the reason I really, really point that out is because we have a lot of people right now you can't see because they're sending us messages where you're listening from. But I mean, that chat is just moving up so fast because we have lots of people. If you send us a question in the chat, it's just going to disappear because we have so many people on here sending us chat messages. So that's, I really want to hammer that in because we have a very handy dandy Q&A panel, and you can see that on the bottom of your screen. You'll have a Q&A button, you'll have a chat button, you'll have a raise hand button. And you know what, just to simplify things, why don't I go ahead and turn that raise hand function off, just because I'd like to say, hey, if you have a question, a tech issue, just send it to me, because otherwise a bunch of people raise hands and there's not a whole lot I can do for you. So go ahead and use that Q&A panel. or send us a chat, for the tech. If it's a tech issue, send me a chat message. I will respond personally. Now, a couple other things for those who have been with us for the previous few webinars. If you've joined us with Ken, we've done a little thing where we wrap up a little bit early on here and we move our Q&A to a completely different platform. It's still Zoom, but it's a Zoom meeting instead. With as many people that joined us for this, we're just going to leave it here. That makes it easy. And Bryan is so technologically savvy. He's such a boss here that he said he's actually going to keep an eye on the Q&A. So I say that because I want to invite you, if you have a question throughout related to the content, just go ahead and ask it. Don't wait for the end of the Q&A session like we've had you do for other ones. Just go ahead and ask it. He said he's going to keep an eye a little bit. I'm not going to hold him to that because he's going to be presenting and doing all the things at once, but go ahead and throw your question in there. If he sees it and he feels it appropriate, there is a possibility he might just go ahead and ask. But the last thing I will say is there is a upvote feature. You'll see if somebody asks a question in Q&A, you can upvote that. Any that we don't get to during the session at the end in the Q&A set aside, those are probably going to be the ones we ask first because they've been upvoted. So that just kind of gives you a little idea of how the tech works. The biggest question we get all the time is, yes, this is being recorded. Do not worry. If something happens, if you miss something, if you're scrambling on your notes and you can't keep up, it is recorded. I will send that out to everyone registered within the next couple of days. I'll try to get it out tomorrow, but no promises. It'll be by the end of the week. So that's really it for me. I could talk on and on and on, but that's pretty much all you need to know. We've already got some questions coming in, so I'll turn my video off. I'll pause myself and I'll start addressing those and pass the ball to Ken to get us started.
Great. Well, thank you everybody for being here. I'm thrilled with the number of folks that have expressed an interest in this particular webinar. And it's very encouraging. This topic came up in the clergy tax webinar so often, but it wasn't just clergy that were kind of wrestling to get their heads around the housing allowance and all these different situations that affect clergy. A lot of the lay leaders in our churches who work with and support our clergy were wrestling with them as well. So I was thrilled to be able to get this together. This would not have happened without Bryan Mills, who's our general counsel at GCFA, and without his willingness to be a part of this. I'll tell you a little bit more about him. Before we do that, I think we have a poll. If you can go to the next slide. There we are. We're going to do a quick poll. Blake's going to put it up. This is not a very expansive, but we just want to get an idea at a really kind of broad area of who's in the group. So if we don't have your particular committee in the church up, please forgive us, but take a minute to do the poll.
Definitely. It is up. We're getting people filling it out very quickly. Just so you know, just for fun, we have 800 people registered for this tonight. So we've already got almost 400. So fill that out. I don't want to take too much time on the poll. So it is there. Make that selection, hit the submit button. We want to make sure that, and we do have a couple people in chat. We've got clergy spouse, we've got conference treasurer. We do have a lot of people chatting to us. If you fit in that other, send us a message. We do want to have that recorded, and because we just want to make sure we get everybody included. So
absolutely.
All right, looks like everybody has answered. So I'm going to end this poll.
Good
We're
deal.
Go ahead and share those results, and that's how we line up.
Okay. So 46% clergy and 12% active clergy, but we have finance team and staff parish people. That's wonderful. And another group, and the other group, which again, we just didn't want to. We wanted to keep this kind of short so we could get to it quick. Let me take a moment just to introduce you to Bryan. As I said, he is the general counsel for our general counsel on finance and administration. They also like to kind of brand themselves as UMC support because they keep this whole connection together and they support churches and annual conferences in so many ways. If you want to kind of find out more about what the agency does, you go to gcfa.org and you can find out more about all the different ways they support you. But I want to thank Bryan for being here. He is really just the right person to talk about the navigating our way through the housing allowance. And Bryan, in his wisdom, has realized that before we talk about the housing allowance, we really need to spend a little time talking about the status of clergy in regard to taxes and self-employment and all those other pieces. And so he's going to do a little bit of that and then kind of take us into this housing allowance thing with that good foundation. I also have to mention a great debt that many of us have to Bryan and his predecessors, because there have been challenges to the whole parsonage system and housing allowance when it comes to the way clergy are treated in taxes. And these attorneys have kind of stood up and kind of helped protect those things. And so it means a lot to me, but I just need to be able to say thank you in that way. So without taking up any more of Bryan's time, I'm going to turn this over to him, and he's going to lead us through there. And again, as you have questions, go to that Q&A. So Bryan, it's your show.
Thank you, Ken. Can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure before I really got going. So yeah, Ken asked me to talk about the housing allowance, and I took the liberty of adding in some other topics as a little bit of an introduction. And the reason I did that is, and I've already seen one person say they're new clergy, and that's the reason why I do it. The housing allowance is one of 4 clergy tax rules, and so a lot of times it's the one that gets the most focus, but the other ones are important as well. And I thought it would be good to at least quickly move through the others before we focus on the housing allowance. So you can see them here. I won't read them, and I know you all have these handouts, and I put lots of stuff in the slides so that handouts are hopefully useful for you at some point later. We'll try not to just sit here and do what I had some college professors do, which is just read the slides to you, because you can do that yourself. So this is the table setting topic, and it's important. Sometimes it gets glossed over, but if there's any conference folks on here, they know that this is a question that comes up. And so it's an important one, and it's kind of a good place to start. So who are we talking about that these rules apply to? Well, there's 2 issues. One, they have to be ministers, and they have to be being paid in relation to the services that they perform in the exercise of their ministry. So ministers, services performed in the exercise of their ministry. And I know you're going, okay, great, Bryan, what's that mean? Well, that's why we have more slides. So who's a minister? And here we're just talking about in the form of the tax code. That's all we care about in this context. Just like lots of things with the IRS and the tax code, there's not just a straight up definition, it's a word, and then the regulations build out kind of what goes into making that determination. So you can see here, there's several factors that are used to determine whether somebody's a minister for tax purposes. Like most factor tests, the more of these you have, the more likely the answer is yes, you're a minister. A little bit of a nuance that's somewhat different for these is that first one, ordained, commissioned, or licensed, you need to be one of those things, those 3 things. If you're talking about somebody who's not ordained, commissioned, or licensed, end of analysis. Not a minister for tax purposes, these rules don't apply to them. They're a lay employee, and you treat them as such. The other piece of this is services performed in the exercise of the ministry. The point here is you can be a fully ordained elder in the United Methodist Church, and I'll make the example absurd. You're working at McDonald's, that's not performing services in the exercise of your ministry. It's an important distinction. If you're retired and you're serving as the janitor of the church you retired from, still a retired fully ordained elder, probably not performing services in the exercise of your ministry. If you're a retired clergy and you're getting paid to be the treasurer of your local church, we're getting closer, right? So there's a lot of nuance here. It's a case-by-case analysis. It's like a lot of things with the tax code. There's stuff that's very clearly the answer is yes, it applies. There's stuff that very clearly, no, it doesn't. And then there's a whole lot of things in the middle where it's facts and circumstances. The IRS has gotten unhelpful here. Unfortunately, this used to be a question that you could ask them. You could provide them with a specific set of facts, and they would give what might be called a revenue rule, a private letter ruling, or something similar to say, based on the facts that you've provided, here's our analysis. They do that for lots of topics. This is not one that they do it for anymore. If you have some questions, if you're unsure, the first line of defense is probably the conference office. You can send an email to legal@gcfa.org. We can kind of help you try and figure it out. And then if you're really not sure, and we're really not sure, the conference isn't really sure, that's the professional tax advisor scenario that might be necessary at one point or another. If it's a little questionable and you're going to make the potentially more aggressive decision to treat them as clergy, doing that on the advice of a professional tax counsel is probably the best way to go. So normally in a face-to-face setting, I would throw these out here and see what everybody thinks. With 388 people online, it doesn't really work. So I'll just kind of run through them real quickly to try and illustrate what we're talking about here. Obviously, the first one, yes. Ordained elder pastoring a local church, minister, performing services in the exercise of ministry. No question. Same thing with number 2, ordained deacon serving as a worship director. Deacon, not an elder, but still ordained. Remember, licensed, commissioned, or ordained. Licensed local pastor serving at a local church. You're starting to hear the buzzwords now, I'm sure. Licensed, so good to go. Certified lay speaker, etc. These terminologies change from time to time, serving at a local church. Well, to use certified, but that's not licensed, commissioned, or ordained. And that second word is the key word here, lay. Right, that pretty much, I get that question from time to time. I'm sure if there's annual conference folks on here, they get that question from time to time. We have a lay supply pastor, lay speaker, lay, etc. They want a housing allowance. Can we do that? Well, you can. Is it going to be taxable? Yes, because they're not going to meet the standard for a minister, and as far as the tax code is concerned. And I've kind of already talked about that last one a little bit. That one's really interesting. It's close. It's really, really close. I might err on the side of not doing it. The flip side of that is we do have elders in the denomination that serve on general agencies in administrative roles. And typically we would say that they would be treated as a clergy in that role, and would be eligible for the housing allowance and the other rules we'll get to. So it's really close. You can make the argument it's akin to that type of setting. I think that's one where that individual got a professional tax advisor. That's probably, I would lean on that person for that advice.
Bryan, can I ask you a question? Is there
Sure.
anything that have to do with like the bishop asking somebody to serve and a thing? Does that carry any weight at all?
It certainly can. It can be one of the factors. When I first started figuring this stuff out, the regulations give examples, and one of the examples they give that would be sufficient, I would have never thought. The regulations give an example of a clergy person within a denomination who has been hired by a for-profit publisher to develop a book about that denomination. The individual was appointed to that position. And in the minds of the tax court or whoever it was that was making the decision, there may have been other factors, but that was one that was certainly considered. And they ultimately decided, in the example in the regulation says that's enough. And that's pretty far afield from being the pastor of a local church, being hired for a for-profit publisher. And the fact that the person was appointed there I think went a long ways towards saying, yes, that person should be treated as a minister for tax purposes. And obviously there's some denominations when that's not even something that you can throw into the mix because they don't have that concept. But I think for this denomination, that's something that can be very helpful to extension ministries and things like that are not kind of fit into the normal view of what might people think as a minister role. So this is a quick tangent. This will be a very quick tangent. It's to set up some other slides, and I can't see anybody, but I can feel from where I'm sitting in the Nashville area that you will be starting to fall asleep if I get into this too much. So, but this is another kind of important building block that I would be remiss if I didn't at least talk about a little bit. So we got two groups of people when you're talking about folks who are working. You got employees and self-employed. And at the same time, there's two categories of taxes. There's income taxes and Social Security taxes. And, just because this is the way things are, they're based on two different things. Taxable income, obviously for income tax purposes, and taxable earnings for Social Security tax purposes. They're not always the same. And that's one of the important things here as we're talking about clergy tax purposes. So, everybody starts, and this is stuff that you all will be familiar with. If you've ever filled out your tax returns, you start with your gross income. And then if you're an employee, you get some deductions, you get some standard deductions. Maybe you can do Schedule A and you can itemize. You push down your gross income and you ultimately end up at taxable income and taxable earnings. For employees, it's kind of one process. For self-employed, it can be a little bit more complicated than that. And again, federal income taxes are based on, if you're an employee, you're a taxable income. If you're in self-employed, then you're self-employed taxable income. And then your Social Security taxes, if you're an employee, that's your FICA. If you're self-employed, that's your SECA taxes. So income taxes really quick, you all know this. If you're an employee, they get withheld from your wages. For self-employed folks, they got to make quarterly estimated payments not subject to withholding. How much is a marginal rate based on what your taxable income is? And marginal rate just means everybody pays the same amount of tax on the first, let's say, $20,000 that they make. So if you make $20,000, you pay 10% on that $20,000. If somebody else makes $35,000, they still only pay 10% on that first 20,000, and then they pay the 15% on that additional. So if you make more money, you're not going to lose money because your tax rate has gone up. It's increments. You only pay that higher tax rate on that additional money. Taxable income, again, it can be different for employees and self-employed because of the different deductions available. Used to be business expenses before the recent Tax Reform Act was available to employees. You had to be able to itemize, which not everybody can do, especially with the increased standard deductions. And some people, it doesn't make sense for them to itemize anymore. And then you had to, your expenses had to exceed 2% of your AGI, which is one of the lines on your tax return on your 1040 as you fill it out. So if you had a little bit in unreimbursed business expenses and it was less than 2%, you wouldn't get to deduct any of them. And if you had something more than 2%, only the additional above 2%. So if you had 2.1% of your adjusted gross income, you'd only get to deduct that 0.1. Self-employed, there's a benefit for self-employed individuals there. Generally, they don't have to worry about floors. They don't have to worry about whether they can itemize or not, because they kind of all itemize anyways. And so there's more opportunity potentially to deduct business expenses that haven't been reimbursed. And also you can see there at the bottom, self-employed receive an income tax deduction from 1/2 of their Social Security taxes. That's to try and bring the two into alignment, because that's the SECA tax. Remember, if you're an employee and you're paying FICA, you're paying half, your employer's paying half. Self-employed, they're the employee and the employer, so they're paying both sides of that. This is just here. You can look at it if you want to, just kind of gets into Social Security taxes a little bit more and how that works. These are different deductions. The important thing here is to understand what you can deduct from one side. You may not be able to deduct from another. Why that matters, we'll get to in a second. And then this is how much. This is updated for this year for the cap. You can see, this is the reason those numbers are double at the bottom, because that's the employee half of FICA taxes, and then the employer is paying the other half. So why did I have all of those slides? That's to get to this question. Are clergy employees or self-employed? And you can see the very not necessarily helpful initial answer, which is depends. So for income tax purposes, United Methodist clergy are treated as employees. The IRS has said so. Some courts have said so. You can see the case there, Weber v. Commissioner. If you ever get really bored or you're having trouble going to sleep, you can Google that citation and read it. My favorite question, I think, in this whole slide is right there is, who did the Weber court say was the employer? Before I get to that, a little bit of brief background how this came up. Reverend Weber wanted and did complete Schedule A. I'm sorry, complete Schedule C. He wanted to be able to itemize things from his income tax standpoint as a self-employed individual, because again, don't have to worry about the floor, easier to take deductions. The IRS said, no, you're an employee, you should use Schedule A. Your income taxes or taxable income is higher, you owe us more in income taxes. He fought the good fight and ultimately lost. The Fourth Circuit there in 1995 said, no, we've gone through all of these facts and circumstances. We determined that in this instance, Reverend Weber is an employee. The answer to the question there is the court didn't say. So it's our clergy are employees with an unnamed employer, which is kind of sort of consistent with our polity, but really interesting from a court ruling standpoint. You see the small exception there if it's things outside coming from individuals you perform weddings for. That's a more classic kind of independent contractor, self-employed situation. This is exclusive to us, at least, and all we really need to worry about. It could be different for folks in other denominations. So that all gets us to rule number one, and I promise you we'll get to rule number 4, which is the housing allowance here pretty quickly. So ministers are treated as self-employed. It's hardwired into the tax code. It's not discretionary. You can't decide to be treated as an employee for Social Security purposes and have the church withhold FICA from your paycheck and pay the employer share of FICA. That's wrong, 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 wrong. As much as you might want it to be right in certain circumstances, it's wrong. So you pay SECA taxes. That means you got to do quarterly estimated payments unless you do voluntary withholding. Related to that is special rule number 2, which is in theory, ministers can opt out of Social Security system altogether, which means you don't pay SECA taxes. That also means you don't get the benefits of Social Security. It is an irrevocable decision. It has to be based on religious opposition to public insurance benefits. We don't have, I believe, the resolution in the Book of Resolutions anymore that has a long glowing sentence about the Social Security system and how great it is. But I used to hold up that copy of the Book of Resolutions that had it in there and say, I hear about United Methodist clergy trying to do this. If it's really a religious-based opposition, it's not based on the denomination's view. You've got to be able to say it's a personally held view that you have for whatever reason. It is swearing to some things under penalty of perjury. So it doesn't happen very often for United Methodist folks. It's definitely more common in other areas. Think of a monk or somebody who's taken a vow of poverty or something like that. So rule number 3 is if you're a minister in this scenario, while you are treated as an employee for income tax purposes, you're different from other employees in that you're exempt from income tax withholding. Why? That's just the way that it is. And I mentioned voluntary arrangements before. That is a way to help defray the quarterly estimated payments or having to set money aside to make the quarterly estimated payments. So you can fill out a W-4 like everybody else does, just do it in the same way. Your number of exemptions And if you want to add an additional amount to cover what your estimated Social Security tax obligations will be, you can write in a dollar amount and do it that way. So I'll let you all do the poll, and I'll scroll through the questions while you're all doing that.
All right, thanks, Bryan. That's great. So this is just to get an idea of, before we get into the housing session, of a lot of churches are doing this differently. There was a time when I know there would be almost all parsonages, but a lot of different situations we know from doing the clergy tax are up. So pick which statement best describes the situation of your local church. And this will kind of give us a view of the variety of different situations we have.
All right, we have lots of people filling this out, so we'll make it quick because we still got a lot of content to cover. So let's go ahead and hit that submit button. And we did say, if you are none of the above, let us know in tax. We've got someone in chat just said, I am 1 and 2. So yeah, I mean, let us know that kind of information too. That absolutely puts you in other. So maybe select the one that you think most fits of those two, and then also let us know in chat. So, all right, I'm going to go ahead and close this. Looks like we've got about 90% have answers. So if you have not hit submit, go ahead and hit submit. And a couple people just hit submit. Okay, here we go. We're going to end it. We're going to share those results. All right. And there we go.
Wow. Okay, that is interesting. We have a larger number of churches, and I'm not saying this is all, you know, I kind of said for your church situation. I know some people are in different situations, but for the church where you attend, we have more than half of the folks on have a pastor who is living in a house that he or she owns or rents, which is really interesting to me. 36%, a little more than a third, are living in a church, in a parsonage. And then I know there are some people who are in multiple appointments, so they may not be living in the parsonage for the church that you attend, or some other situation. And then a bunch of folks who say that none of these particular situations fit their circumstance. All right, Bryan, that gives you a clear picture of how to work into this next section there.
Okay, great. So I'm seeing a lot of retirement-based questions. Don't take this personally, I'm going to ignore them for a little bit. We'll talk about retirement situations and as we move forward. And I see some other questions that are housing allowance specific, which is what we're about to dive into. There's a couple regarding some of the things I've just discussed. Somebody asked what if somebody is not a United Methodist Church minister? That's a really interesting question. And it doesn't have an answer that I can hang my hat on anywhere. What I say in that situation is the tax code says you got to be two things. You got to be a minister, and you got to be doing things that are in furtherance of your ministry. It doesn't necessarily say that you have to be doing those in the same denominations. So I think it's at least possible and I have seen nothing in the IRS say anything about this one way or the other. But I think there's a pretty decent argument that if somebody is licensed, commissioned, or ordained in denomination A, and is, for example, serving as the pastor of a local church in denomination B, I think there's a pretty good argument that checks all the boxes. I have never seen anything that requires those both to have happened in the same denomination or be happening in the same denomination. The caveat is I've also never said anything that says that doesn't matter. So it's an unknown area. I don't think it's a really aggressive tax position to be treated as a minister in that scenario. Just understand there's not really much that anybody is going to be able to point to as definitive guidance one way or the other. Another question, if clergy are self-employed, why to receive a W-2 instead of a 1099? I want to make sure that's clear. You are self-employed. You're self-employed for Social Security purposes. You're treated as an employee for income tax purposes. So that's why you get the W-2 instead of the 1099. Employees for income tax purposes get W-2s. And there's a couple other popped up. Let's just see. Somebody asked, what is a reference for a rule that churches do not withhold income tax for clergy? I will try, and I have that in another slide or in another presentation. I can get that statutory site, and I'll get it to Ken, and that can be shared afterwards. Ken, don't let me forget to do that, please.
Okay, great.
Okay, so now the reason why we're here. Rule number 4 gets its own slide. So the housing allowance. It's section 107 of the tax code, and it has 2 subsections, 107.1 and 107.2. And you can see those are right there. That's the fair rental value of a home provided to a minister as part of the minister's compensation, can be excluded from gross income, and then parsonage or a housing allowance used to provide a home can also be excluded from gross income. It's important to understand it's an exclusion, not a deduction. So we just talked about W-2. It won't show up in the wage box on W-2 because it's excluded from income. It's as if it doesn't exist for taxation purposes. It's not something that's there. And then like a deduction on Schedule A, it gets taken out. It's just not there to begin with. That last bullet there is really, really, really important for all of you who are clergy and doing your own taxes or watching other people do your taxes. If you've got a housing allowance, for example, it is not go into your taxable income. It does get included in your taxable earnings for Social Security purposes. So you don't pay income tax on it, but you do pay Social Security tax on it. It's a really important distinction and can trip some folks up. There's a couple different ways it can be done. There's the in-kind provision of a parsonage that explains itself. What is technically excluded there from income is the fair rental value of that parsonage, furnished plus utilities. The other option, which many of you probably have, is a cash allowance. This is my terminology here so that y'all know what I'm talking about when I use these words. Not everybody uses it. And some might say housing exclusion, parsonage exclusion. I've seen annual conference compensation forms that have a housing allowance line and a housing exclusion line. I don't understand the difference between those two things. I don't know if the conference understood the difference between those two things, but for my purposes, here are my definitions. So it's the same thing, just a different scenario. The difference is the clergy person living in the parsonage or is the clergy person living in his or her own home that they own or rent? So that's what I mean. The treatment ultimately is the same, but you see lots of terms thrown around. That is also potentially excludable as from taxable income. The amount's limited. We'll get to that here in a second. But again, a very important reminder, whatever it is that you exclude from income tax, you have to include when you're determining your Social Security taxable earnings. So what has to happen for a housing allowance or a parsonage allowance? Really one thing for it to be possible, which is the local church designates an amount in advance that's critical, that's required. It can't be done retroactively. So ideally then your church is doing it for you the year before. So sometime between now and the end of 2021, your church designates your housing or parsonage allowance for 2022. Then it's unquestionably in advance before January 1st in the year in which it goes into effect. That's the front end. The back end is what can actually be excluded, and it's the lesser of 3 things. It's the amount of the designation, the amount of qualified expenses actually incurred. Those are the expenses incurred in owning or renting a home, and the fair rental value of the parsonage and home. And we'll come back to that in a second because that can cause some problems for some folks. Quickly on qualified expenses. I saw some questions about this. This is an area that's ripe for questions, especially as technology changes and living realities change and the tax code stays the same. The broad definition here is it's expenses used in owning or providing a home. Some of these things are really obvious: rent, mortgage, property taxes, down payments. I'll come back to down payments and some other things, some lump sum stuff in a moment. insurance, any kind of improvements or repairs. You got to repair repair or replace your roof or your hot water heater. You want to go to a tankless, which I've learned is a wonderful thing to do if you have kids in the house. I highly recommend it. I don't have to take cold showers anymore, which is wonderful. Utilities obviously are covered. You can see the box over there. Utilities can, it's a pretty broad term. It's unhelpfully not defined very well by the IRS. I think phone service is very clearly utilities. This is 2021. Internet service, I think very clearly something that can be covered. I put cell phone service there. I think if you have a landline for your house, you can probably do the landline. Can you do the landline and the cell phone? I think that's maybe a step too far. But if you don't have a landline, maybe you can argue the cell phone kind of stands in that gap. Talk to your tax advisor about that one. Cable or satellite TV, I think is fairly standard at this point. Streaming, I think, has made this more complicated. That's why I put Netflix subscription there. I don't know. It's not tied to your house anymore. And I think the IRS hasn't fleshed out any of this stuff. But as things get disconnected from the building that is the house, I think it gets harder and harder to say it's necessary or related to providing the home. When you can watch your Netflix subscription from your phone while you're listening to me drone on and on about taxes, even whether you're in your house or not, I think it gets difficult. That one might be a little aggressive. Yard maintenance, Billy down the street paying him to cut your grass, that would be covered. Not a whole lot on the list of things that clearly aren't. Again, not much guidance from the IRS here. Groceries, clothes, music, toiletries. If any of you are making enough to have maids or butlers, you cannot exclude those expenses. And also, can I come live with you? So, there's questions that come up here, and it's like a lot. It's like whether you're a minister or not. There's clear things on both ends of the spectrum. For a long time, there wasn't much gray area in the middle. As technology changes, streaming and getting cutting the cord and those types of things. I think it creates some questions that we probably won't have clear answers to from the IRS for a while, if ever. I don't think this is something in an area that's really high on their priority list. I think I saw this a question around this in the Q&A. What happens if you determine as you do your taxes that you can't exclude everything that was designated? Or if there's any excess, then you've got to report that and add that on your 1040 as taxable income. And then that'll be factored into what your ultimate tax liability is at the end of the year. You see the moral here. Churches and clergy should work together to try and be as accurate as possible. And something Ken and I were talking about before this started. The consequences to the individual of it being set too high is what's on this slide. Something that would have been taxable anyway is still taxable because you weren't able to exclude it. That can be fixed at the end of the year when you're filling out your tax return. The opposite can't be fixed. If it's too low, that's a lost opportunity for you as a pastor, or for if we got church folks here, and for your pastor of your church. You can't fix that. You can't go back and change it. Remember, it's got to be done in advance. You can't do it retroactively. So if you're going to err one way or the other, err a little bit on the side of overestimating rather than underestimating. You should start to get a pretty good sense of it after doing it for a couple of years, especially if you're living in the same house or your pastor's living in the same house, unless they've done some additions or done some refinancing or something like that. You should get a pretty good sense of what it is. Again, I just said this, remember, it's in advance, has to be done in advance. Get it done before January 1. The changes can happen. They can get kind of complicated because it starts getting into getting into some math, which seems straightforward, but then you start getting into it and you go, okay, hold on, what's going on here? So I tried to illustrate this with an example. So church does everything right, sets the pastor's annual housing allowance for next year at $12,000. 6 months into the year, the church increases that annual amount to 24. So for the year, it went from 12,000 to 24,000. So the maximum the pastor then can exclude from taxable income is 18,000. And you go, why? Well, yes, the designation is 24,000 total, but half of that increase only gets counted. So for the first 6 months, it was $1,000 a month was the designation. So that's $6,000. Then it was increased effectively to $2,000 a month for the rest of the year. So you get $12,000 for that, for those 6 months. So that adds up to 18. You don't get the full 24. Where things can get even more complicated potentially is the matching of expenses. Another area, I know I keep saying it, but there's not a whole lot of IRS guidance on. But let's say the reason the pastor asked for this is all of a sudden property taxes went up and didn't realize it. Or it's an adjustable rate mortgage and mortgage rates went up and actual expenses have gone up. And say the pastor actually had more than 6,000 in expenses for those first 6 months. So there's an open question as to whether this can recapture any of it retroactively, not just because the number's higher, but if it's the expenses occur, and I know this gets really complicated and it's really hard to explain, but if the expenses occurred before the increase, that can cause a problem. And the example I just gave may not matter because for the rest of the 6 months may have $12,000 there in that 6 months, and more than 6,000 was already incurred at the beginning. So he's going to hit the $18,000 and it doesn't matter. But if there's a situation where the actual expenses don't exactly line up, may not be able to recover all of them because of the timing. So just something to be aware of. Again, tax advisor is really great for this type of situation if something like this does happen. And we're getting close here to the end, and I'll start looking in the direction of the questions. The fair rental value thing can really trip folks up in very isolated situations that you may not, just something to be aware of. And I don't know if I just made this up off the top of my head for this slide, for this presentation. So if this triggers anybody because of it hits a little too close to home, this scenario, I apologize in advance. So I'll just kind of walk through it really quickly. So pastor annually incurs around $15,000 in qualified expenses associated with owning her home, which is less than its $17,500 annual fair rental value. Remember, what can be excluded is the lesser of the designation, actual expenses, or the fair rental value. Okay, so what we're saying here is her actual expenses are generally less on a year-by-year basis than the fair rental value of the home. So the fair rental value of the home can't be excluded because it's bigger than one of the other numbers. So here, her allowance would typically be around the $15,000. Making it higher isn't going to change anything because the actual expenses are then the lowest. So you see the next sentence for 2021, pastor's church set her housing allowance at $15,000. And at the end of the year, it turns out she can exclude all $15,000 because let's just say her actual expenses came in right at that number. But something happens, things change, right? Late in the year in 2021, pastor's adult son and his spouse and his 2 young children move in on what she expects or fears, depending on what your perspective might be, will be an indefinite basis. She goes, oh no, we have a 2-bedroom house, or we have a whatever. This is not going to work. This is going to be a permanent situation. They're never going to leave. I'm going to go crazy. We're going to kill each other unless, and she goes, let's do an addition. Okay. Work will begin in early 22. It's going to cost $30,000. She saved well. She can pay for the addition out of pocket, and will pay for it before the year is over in 2022. So the scenario I've created here is her actual expenses has gone up from 2022 from the normal $15,000 to $45,000. Again, if we were in a group, I would say, what can she exclude? Can she exclude the 45? You would all say resoundingly, no. And why? I don't know if I can highlight this because the PDF I might be able to. Nope, I tried, I failed. The $17,500 annual fair rental value. Is that going to go up by adding another room or two to the house? Sure. Is it going to go up by $28,000 on an annual basis? No. So maybe the annual fair rental value goes up to $20,000. So she would be able to exclude $20,000 that year, as long as her designation is at least that much, because her actual expenses are going to be at least that much. But then the following year, you know, go back to a normal. So this comes up in repairs. This comes up in additions, expansions, renovations, a down payment. Put $40,000 down on a home, and that's 20% of the purchase price. The fair rental value of that home is not going to be $40,000. So even if you have your housing allowance designation adjusted, you're not going to be able to exclude all of that. That fair rental value can pop up as a problem. For the retired folks, there's not a whole lot here to say because it's really not a whole lot different. The lesser of three things still applies. The difference here is your pension payments are annually designated 100% as a housing allowance. Your annual conference does that every year. There's a form that every annual conference has that its annual session adopts every year. Contact your annual conference if you need a copy of it for your own record keeping purposes, or to give to your tax preparer to support the exclusion. What can happen, or what can run, again, you still got to deal with the lesser of three things. So if you lived in the same house for 40 years, you've probably paid it off. So your actual expenses are really low, potentially, because you don't have a mortgage. You've got insurance, you've got taxes, you've got maintenance and things. Maybe you buy some furniture here and there, but typically the mortgage is the big piece of that. So yes, in theory, you can exclude some or all of your pension payments from being taxable as delayed compensation for your ministerial services. But it's really going to depend on your specific circumstances in retirement as to how much of that you're going to be able to capture and not have to pay tax on. And and Westpath is an excellent resource for any and all things retirement related, including some in the housing allowance issues. Ken mentioned this. I didn't put it in the slide, or I put it in the presentation so he would talk about it, but this is something, it was very, very much on everybody's mind for a long time. It's gone away, and it's less of an issue now. There's no current challenges that I'm aware of. I actually just, in preparation for this session, I checked the Freedom from Religion Foundation's website just to see if they were active in this area again, and I hadn't heard about it. They seem to have given up, at least for now. They did try a number of times to get Section 107 declared unconstitutional. They had some temporary wins, but ultimately lost. GCFA was not directly involved in any of these lawsuits. We joined a number of briefs every time this came up in support of the housing allowance. Did that make a difference? I don't know. But you know, we did, and a number of other denominations did together file some things in these cases to try and make sure it stayed around. This is, I think, basically the last slide. I wanted you to be aware of these resources. That first one from Richard Hammer, I don't know how many of you can actually see me. It's this thick. It's a big book. It covers a lot of stuff. It's probably more written for tax lawyers or tax professional CPAs but it has an incredible amount of information. It has a lot of examples. It's a place I go to for some really interesting situations to try and figure it out. It's not a bad thing to have. The second one from Dan Busby, it's much smaller. It's written more for non-professionals, and it covers a lot of the same topics, just more kind of plain language, not as many citations to private letter rulings and revenue rulings and tax regulations and things. Just kind of lays it out there for you. I would really commend that one to churches and clergy person. It's not just about these issues that we're talking about here, either of those books. They cover a lot of church related tax, nonprofit tax related issues, UBIT, property tax issues, other types of things, sales tax exemptions and the like, how to do charitable acknowledgements, etc., on and on and on. And then IRS publication 517, geared towards clergy and how to deal with clergy related tax issues. So I would commend that one to you as well. And that's the end. What are our high ranking questions?
Well, let's see here. We have a lot of them. So here's what I would say. I said this in the chat, but I will say it out again. We have a lot of questions. I doubt we'll have time for all of them. So go to that Q&A panel, hit that button, that Q&A button, and read through them, scan through them, upvote the ones. And by upvote, I mean hit that little thumbs up button next to the ones that really stand out. And you say, ooh, that just kind of how I hate to not answer some questions, but that just helps us answer the ones that are really the most helpful to everyone. So
Yeah,
okay, I saw an easy one real quick.
Go for it.
On making designations in advance. It says, so if there's not a housing allowance in place right now, there can be none until 2022, right? No, you can do one now. You can do mid-year designations. It's only effective through the date that it was adopted through the end of the year. So if you do an annual, so like kind of like my example, if it starts out at 0 and then June or at July 1, the church adopts a $12,000 annual housing allowance, then you've got a housing allowance for the year. It's just, it's an annual allowance. So you only get to capture 6,000 of that. And that's where it really becomes hyper technical and you got to be really careful. You probably in that scenario cannot count expenses accrued prior to July 1st. There's questions about that, but you know, I talked about Richard Hammer. He has a whole page going through this, and there's not really anything definitive. His conclusion, by and large, is that's pretty aggressive. Maybe not a good idea to do because you can't match the expenses to the time when the designation was made. But if you got expenses through the end of the year, go ahead and get a designation done. You can at least get something. I'm sorry, Ken, you had a question.
No, I was just going to ask, and I'm sure Blake, probably better we get to some of the other questions that people have asked about. Somebody put up about a clergy couples. You know, can a couple have two housing allowances if they're serving two different churches?
Yes, but and the answer might change depending on how they do their taxes. Mm-hmm. This is definitely a professional tax advisor is very advisable scenario. I would be very careful about trying to exclude a combined amount of income for a single home that exceeds the value of it. It's not that you both get to say, I have a $15,000 designation. I have $15,000 in actual expenses. I also have a $15,000 designation from a different church. I likewise have those $15,000 in actual expenses. So combined, we can exclude 30. No, mm-hmm. Combined, you can probably exclude the 15. And if it was, for whatever reason, 7 was designated by one church and 8 was designated by one church, you could probably combine that together to get to the 15 in actual. That's probably fine. But it can get complicated pretty quickly. But in general, it can be done. You just don't want to end up with a result where you've excluded more than
Right.
the fair rental value
Right.
of the home or the actual expenses. If you're living in two homes, things might get different. But if you're living in the same place, you've got one set of expenses. You don't get to double count.
Great. All right, Blake, go to the list.
Great. Well, I mean, the easy one is because it is it is in there 3 times, and the top voted are who determines the fair rental value, and what is the best way to determine that of a parsonage, and the implications in retirement of that figure. And let me know if I'm asking this wrong, but if this figure is set lower to reduce my taxes now. That's like a whole bundle of questions.
Okay, I see it. I didn't realize that all the ones with the most thumbed up are the top. So what's the best way to determine the fair rental value of a parsonage? Get an appraisal. It doesn't, it can be a rental appraisal and from a real estate professional. What could you rent this out for? And it's really can be that straightforward. You want to update it from time to time. If you're living in Nashville, you probably need to update it like once every 3 weeks. The way housing prices are going crazy around here, it's quickly become out of date with stuff selling for 20% above asking price. But yeah, I mean, that's what you do. You just keep it as a record. If it ever gets questioned, you can provide it to the clergy who's submitting the taxes. Here's where that number came from. For a parsonage, it's important. It's not as important. The clergy person still needs to know that fair rental value because it has to be included in taxable earnings for Social Security purposes. And if it's a parsonage, the church probably on the church to get that appraisal done. If it's somebody living in their own or owning their own home, then they probably need to get that done for themselves. And obviously, if they're renting the home, then they pretty much know the answer unless it's subsidized in some way and not reflective of actual fair market rental value. Let's see. Oh, somebody was just appointed to a church, and the church I'm serving does not know what their housing allowance is. Yeah, you and the church need to work together to set one for you. What might have been set for their prior pastor would not apply to you. That's something, appointment season and new appointments kick in. And then if somebody's shifting appointments and moving from church A to church B, need to very quickly get church B to designate a housing allowance for the remainder of that year. And then when November or December comes around, make sure they get one for the full calendar year that comes up next. So yeah, you just need to work with them and try and get something that reflects closely both what your actual expenses will be for the rest of the year, and then doesn't bump into that fair rental value of where it is that you're living issue.
And the let's see, I think curious about specifics surrounding retirement income and housing allowance. I'm pretty sure you covered that, but is there any sort of like list anywhere that people? I mean, I know that you said it's not super clear and helpful, but I don't know, what's a resource to go to?
Well, we do have on our website. We do have a housing allowance Q&A. It's 15, 16, 17 pages long. Goes through a bunch of questions and answers. Ken, I'll get the link to that.
Well, here, I'll find it right
to you
now
as well.
Let's see here. I've got a GCFA tax packet. Would that?
That's it. The tax packet.
Well,
there's a bunch of different stuff there.
Let's put that in the chat right now.
Great. That's great, Blake.
Put that aside. There we go. That's everything.
Somebody asked, do I need to hang on to 7 years of utility bills for tax purposes? 7 years is a tax-related retention period. I can't say with confidence off the top of my head if that's how many years back the IRS could look at your taxes and potentially audit you. Whatever that number is, you definitely want to keep them for at least that long. If you these types of audits don't happen very often, but they do occur, and so you definitely would want to, if you ever get the question, you want to be able to support your determination of how much you could actually exclude which does then reflect what your actual expenses were.
Real quick, Brian, somebody had asked a question about does their status of being half-time, quarter-time, full-time affect how much housing allowance they can receive? Can a half-time pastor still receive fair rental value, or do they have to half that? How does that work?
Yeah, and I see a question that's, I think, pretty related. Is there a cap on the housing allowance? So I think I'll try and illustrate that with both of those, maybe with the same example. So let's say we have a pastor appointed half-time and getting paid a smaller amount based on that, let's say $30,000, and ask the church to designate all of that as a housing allowance. Then the church might go, well, wait, can we do that? Can we designate all of it? Is that okay? That's 100%. Is there not, can it not be more than 50% of salary or 75% or whatever? The IRS doesn't have a cap. There's no legal cap. There's a cap that I would say is red flag type of cap. So my scenario, half-time pastor getting paid $30,000, asked for $30,000 in designation. Maybe that pastor has $30,000 in actual expenses. The other thing I'll say is it's a pretty decent house for the fair rental value to be $30,000, but maybe that part-time pastor is the rest of the part-time is a CPA in a big law firm and makes $300,000 doing that job, and so lives in a really big, nice house, and so $30,000 doesn't even come close to covering the mortgage payments for the year. Ken and I were talking about this before. Could have a quarter-time pastor who's making $20,000 and wants all of it, but his wife is a neurosurgeon, and they live in a $3 million mansion. So the church just needs to stop and think, what's going on here? You got a full-time pastor that asks for 100% of it to be designated. You know, pretty much that probably that pastor's living situation and whether that makes sense, or you need to ask some more questions. What I tell churches all the time is you can do it, but you want to be sure that it's not opening up the door for your pastor to do something questionable or worse than questionable from a tax return standpoint, because the headline will be pastor of church so-and-so arrested for tax evasion or tax fraud. And you don't want to unwittingly or ignorantly encourage something like that to happen. So just ask some questions. You kind of know sort of the scenario. I'm not aware of anything that says somebody who's half-time only gets to account for half of the fair rental value of a house, or is quarter time and only gets to account for quarter time of actual expenses or quarter time of the fair rental value. I've never seen anything that requires that type of correlation.
Okay, thanks. That's good. Blake,
I see somebody asking about housing allowance and pension contributions. I'm pretty sure built into the retirement plan, that's factored into a formula somehow. I don't know exactly if it's dollar for dollar or if it's some percentage. I don't know how that works. If your annual conference can help you on that, Westpath certainly can, and tell you how that gets factored into what is contributed on your behalf for your retirement.
Right, we've got, how about how do we go about paying, is it SECA tax, SECA tax?
Yes.
Brian, could you click to the next slide so people are jumping off? If they can get your information, that'd be great.
Yeah, yeah.
If you click to the next one, I think has your contact information on
just
it.
zooming in.
You're zooming.
Oh, I'm hitting the zoom.
Zoom.
That's me, sorry. Hitting the wrong button. Let's just go back to using the arrows.
There we go. That's good. Great.
So I lost the question.
SECA tax.
Oh, SECA. Yes, thank you. Those are done by quarterly estimated payments. So what that means is every 3 months through the year, you have to file a return with the IRS where you estimate what your income, what your taxable earnings, your income was for that 3 months, and you have to make an estimated payment based on that to the IRS. That's the stand-in for self-employed folks for the withholding. The IRS likes having their money. They like withholding. If they have to give some of it back to you, they'll do that, but they would much rather have all of it to start. And so for self-employeds who don't have withholding happen, that's the equivalent system as the quarterly estimated payments. There might be adjustments having to be made at the end of the year because they're estimates. For most self-employed people, their income may fluctuate from quarter to quarter. So they may overpay when it's all said and done. They may have overpaid a little bit in quarter one and underpaid in quarter four. But that's how it gets done.
Gotcha.
And
Okay,
again, if you do voluntary withholding and you specify an additional amount to be withheld to cover your SECA liability, you can show when you fill out the form that amount paid in is some dollar amount that's hopefully pretty close to what your quarterly estimated payment would be, and you have to send a much smaller check or no check at all.
Gotcha. Well, Ken, talk to me about your timeline. I do want to honor everybody's time, but we do have a ton of questions here. What are you thinking there?
Yeah, if we can do maybe one or two more on, and Bryan, people hopefully have captured your the legal GCFA you mentioned already, so they have questions that they need to reach out to you. If you'll just click down, I won't even have to read the stuff, but I just want to have that there for people who sign off, that we have a couple of webinars coming up. So if you could
Definitely.
just click us down to, and that you can go past that one because most people have my email address there. That'd be great. September 21st, talking about the craft of asking people to give. And then in the 16th, inviting generosity beyond the Sunday offering. We'll talk about other ways that people have opportunities to give. So let's see if you can get a couple more in. That'd be great. I know it looks like 95 total is our question. It's kind of pile.
Well, I'm going to dismiss our top one because I think you answered that, and that should be in that GCFA list that I sent over. And just in case you missed that, that is in the chat again. And
Q&A will be great, folks. Yeah,
definitely. I'll answer the big one right now. We've had a bunch of people asking about the recording. I will send that out to you, so no worries at all. You'll get that in your inbox. It typically takes me a couple days. Zoom has to process the recording. I've got to then, master it. But I'll try to get it out tomorrow. We'll see what I can do. But I will directly email you that. No worries. Just keep an eye on your email. If for some reason you don't hear from me in the next week, it probably went to spam. So just email me or email Ken directly. I want to make sure if you're wanting that recording that you get access to it. But yep, it will be emailed to you. So no worries about that. You don't have to do anything for that.
If there's any objections, I'll try and knock out a couple of these questions really quickly.
I'll just let you run with it.
Do you have to submit every receipt to the IRS for the exclusion? No, you don't need to submit receipts. You need to keep your records. It's supporting documentation. You don't need to send that in when you send in your return, unless it's specific, unless you're filling out the form and it specifically asks you to attach a particular item. Usually what you just need to do is you've done a calculation, you've done a spreadsheet, you've added it up in some way, what your actual expenses are. Keep the documentation that supports how you got to that total, especially if that's the amount that you try to exclude, if it ever gets questioned. How do two different congregations handle housing allowance or sharing of a parsonage with a couple that lives in the parsonage owned by one of the congregations? This is a practical issue, but the churches can do this any number of ways. They can work out a cost sharing arrangement where one church is reporting it, and if there needs to be a designation made, the church makes that designation, and the churches between the two of them, and this doesn't really impact what happens from a tax standpoint for the clergy couple, but the church A can contribute some amount of money to church B to help defray the costs of providing the parsonage. If there's an additional designation, a parsonage allowance designated, can split that 50-50 or some other way. That's really just a practical thing for the two churches to work out how they want to come together and fund that, support that together. What's the difference between a housing allowance in lieu of a parsonage and a parsonage exclusion? The parsonage exclusion is the in-kind provision of a parsonage. And in my terminology, that's what is excluded from taxable income, the fair rental value of that parsonage that the individual is living in. An allowance is cash. And churches can do this. Churches do this different ways. They might say, Pastor, we're going to pay you $60,000 in salary. And we're going to then give you a designated housing allowance of $10,000 on top of that for a total of 70. Other churches might say that same pastor, we're going to pay you a salary of $70,000. And of that $70,000, we're going to designate 10,000 of that as a housing allowance, or whatever number it is that you need us to designate that is within reason and doesn't give us cause for concern. So parsonage exclusion, provision of a place to live, a housing allowance or a parsonage allowance. Anytime you see allowance, that's talking about the cash that's been designated. Let's see, I touched on that one. I'm trying to find ones that I can read quickly. I'm slow readers, everybody. So if your question was longer, I apologize. Okay, do we get to exclude both the fair rental value and the qualified expenses? Well, maybe, but it's not a total. Remember, it's the lesser of three things: the amount of the designation, the qualified expenses, or the fair rental value. So if the fair rental value is bigger than the qualified expenses, you're limited to the qualified expenses, as long as your designation is at least that high. So what you don't want to have happen ever is the designation is the least of the three, because that means your pastor or you as the pastor have lost the opportunity to exclude some amount of income from being taxable. So you don't ever want the designation to be the least of the three things. It needs to either be the actual expenses or the fair rental value. You can't add the two of those up and exclude the total of those two. It's one or the other, as long as the designation is high enough. This is a good one. If a pastor lives in a parsonage but also owns a home, such as a vacation or retirement home, can you count expenses from both homes? No. There is a tax court and federal circuit court of appeals case on this. Makes it very clear it applies to a single home. There are some crazy scenarios in which maybe you can get to a different answer if you've got two different employers and two different sets of responsibilities and two different houses, and everything, but very, very, very unlikely to happen. So if you're thinking either you're living in a parsonage and you have a home elsewhere, or you own two different homes, you have your regular home and then you have a lake house or a beach house or whatever, or a condo in the city, whatever the case may be, you got to limit yourself to one of them. And it's going to probably almost certainly need to be the one that is your primary residence, not your vacation destination. Okay, Ken, I think we're at an hour 40. What is it? Hour 15. I could keep going.
I think we better. Yeah, we could go on all night.
It's 7:45 here, so it's getting even later for the East Coast folks.
And Bryan, thank you for that.
I'll also remind you folks that this particular, having Bryan come and do it at this time, the main reason was to get your housing allowance squared away for the coming year. Bryan talked about a number of times. We are going to do another clergy tax webinar in February, as we always do. And we have, like Bryan's Q&A, we have a lot of tax Q&A things that Don Joyner has helped me with. But the main purpose here was to understand this better so you can get this right for 2022. If you know it's low or you don't have one in place, focus on the next year and get that done. So I appreciate that. I'm so grateful to Bryan for doing this and taking the time from his evening and his family to be with us. Please, folks, complete the survey that you're going to be directed to. It really will help us in terms of how we plan things in the future. And again, we appreciate you taking the time to be with us tonight. It's great. And we hope that you all have a wonderful evening. Thanks to Blake for making all the technology work.
Absolutely.
And again, for Bryan for bringing his expertise. So
Wonderful. And I would say as a favor, just go ahead and click that link in the chat right now, you know, just in case. You can always delete that email, but click that link for us, fill it out. That just makes sure it gets done right now while it's on your mind. It does help us a lot to prepare better presentations for you in the future. But that's it. Bryan, thanks for
Right.
staying late. And thank you, everybody else. Have a great night.
All right.
Bye
Thanks.
bye, everybody. Have a good
Both
one.
of you.
Bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.